for example, if there is a sale of company or there is a bonus which is coming in, right? It's something which is not expected and it comes in suddenly.
Yeah.
So yes, we do say that fine, whatever your requirements or aspirations are as far as your lifestyle is concerned, you kind of set aside that pot of money and that you kind of pre-decide, and that's fine. Otherwise, it's not an endless. Otherwise, what typically happens is that the money comes in, it lies for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, and then suddenly you see it disappear.
Exactly.
Because like
Yeah,
what you said,
yeah.
you buy a fancy
Yeah.
watch or a car or a fancy bag, right? But important is that if you are setting aside when the money is coming in, saying that okay, 20% of that I'm going to kind of set aside for my lifestyle requirement, and 80% I will kind of invest.
That's a good number. It's a generous number.
It's
Old timers like me would say 90-10 or maybe 95-5, maybe even 100
Yeah.
should go into investment
yeah, because
completely.
inflation is now
Yeah, but 80-20 is a good number.
yeah,
20% set aside
yeah,
for indulgence or
and,
whatever.
and that money I would say that take more risk, whatever you're investing.
Interesting.
So that 80% you can take more risk than what you would normally do from your normal salary. So that 80% don't put it again into an SIP, which is the same asset allocation as was there earlier.
Oh, nice. I
Yeah,
didn't think
because
of
there's
it that
something which
way.
you're not expected.
It's a lump sum. Yeah,
It's a lump sum, and therefore you can take that risk, saying that fine, let me kind of take more kind of risk, unless you have a goal in mind, saying okay, I want to buy a house after 3 years, and this will help me buy that house. Then it's a different thing.
Oh yeah, but then that gets allocated there directly.
Then you go into arbitrage fund for the next 3 years till the time that you are going to buy a house.
Keep your goal in mind.
Keep your goal in mind.
Keep your goal in mind, and of course.
But otherwise, take risk and kind of invest, and because that's where your wealth creation will happen.
Folks, welcome to Paisa. I'm your host Anupam Gupta, B50 on Twitter. And on today's episode, I'm talking about an interesting topic, a term that even I have learned these days, generational wealth. Okay? But we're going to have a lot of fun and a lot of insights talking about this because my guest, Nimish Shah, Managing Director, Family Offices and Portfolio Analytics at LGT Wealth India. We're going to talk about how wealthy families stay wealthy or decline, the third generation, because what's in it for you? Maybe all of us are in rich, but there are some lessons out there about how they invest and how you can position your portfolio accordingly. Nimish, welcome to Paisa. Atul was here from Validus. I mean, he used to be Validus, which is now part of LGT, and he was like back in, November 2020. We did that online. Here you are in the studio. Thank you for doing this for our listeners. Great to have LGT now, right?
Yes, thank you, Anupam, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So let's start about LGT Validus. How did that out? I think there was an acquisition or something.
That's right.
Please
so
tell us.
Atul started Validus, after he kind of quit as a CEO of Julius Baer. And since then, as Validus grew, the need for capital came in, and that's where he found LGT as a good partner. And therefore, we are now LGT Wealth India. So it's more of a global firm, but with more of local perspective. Because all the kind of top management and the employees, we are almost about 240 people plus now in about 12 cities. So it's more like kind of giving you the local flavor, but still kind of grounded by the global aspects in terms of what the good principles are, what are the kind of compliance requirements globally which are there. So that's where LGT Wealth India fits in. So we are basically a wealth manager. And essentially kind of wanting to take clients through the entire wealth cycle which they will have. And kind of positioning it more from the perspective of a holistic wealth planning, rather than only looking at products or only looking at the investment options.
So where is LGT based? US, Europe? Where is it?
So LGT is a European-based, a family business, and it's 100% owned by the family. And as we go more into generational wealth, like you said, just to give a perspective, the current chairman of LGT, which is Prince Max, is the 26th generation who's managing the business.
Okay, I won't even ask how many number of years is that, but 26th generation. My God, okay.
So that kind of brings in a different perspective in terms of how wealth is kind of handed over. But importantly, for the private banking perspective, they are kind of in the largely in Europe and in Asia. In Asia itself, they are more than about 38 years now in Asia, and globally they are about 90 years plus in private wealth management. So it's a kind of in a firm with a good MNC background. But here, in terms of the way we are kind of functioning, it's more from the perspective of giving the local flavor and the requirements what the Indian families and the Indian HNIs would require.
Yeah. So let's jump into a generational wealth. I mean, we're talking about someone who's leading this organization who's into his 26th generation.
Yep.
India's rich, I would say, has been a little bit different in the last few years with the economic progress. So From an Indian context, what is this generational wealth?
Sure. So, generational wealth, just to put it very simply, is something where the wealth which has been created would go beyond the current generation, right? So, therefore, you need to plan in terms of how the transition of wealth will happen, and that involves a lot of things. So, right from understanding, the culture of the family, understanding the values and the principles that the family has followed, understanding simple things like the philanthropy aspects which the family has been doing, right? How that all transitions into the next generation. I think that becomes important for the perspective of generational wealth. Coming to India, kind of it is more from the perspective that while we have had a few families in the past which are more like industrialist family generate wealth, but now it's kind of coming where we have a lot of new age entrepreneurs coming into wealth by selling their businesses. We have a lot of monetization of assets like land and building and everything. We also have a lot of professionals who have kind of come into a lot of money because of the ESOPs which they have, and therefore it is something which they have earned, which is something they have gathered, and which definitely is going to last beyond their own lifetime. So that's where the generational wealth aspect comes in. And the way India is kind of growing right now, even in if you look at tier 3, tier 4 cities, the amount of wealth being generated by entrepreneurs and by monetization of assets is quite significant, and therefore it becomes very important to understand what are the various aspects and nuances related to making sure that your wealth is being kind of the wealth which has been created is protected and it grows and it passes on without any much of one is in terms of legality, and second also is in terms of costs, which are the taxes, and in terms of the fees or the various aspects related to that.
Very interesting. So, if I were to ask for a pie chart of new wealth versus old wealth,
Right.
what would that look like?
So, in terms of number of clients, the new wealth is more. But if you look at the in the AUM, the old wealth is more.
Old wealth is more.
So that's where the transitioning is happening, because they have seen, say, 3 generations, 4 generations where the wealth has accumulated, and therefore automatically, even if you look at a simple compounding of 10% per annum,
Even that is
it's a
significant, yeah.
magnificent amount that they would have created.
And that is why I want to focus our oncoming discussion on the older wealth thing, because for a lot of people, listeners and viewers, the whole thing about getting rich is one thing. I'm sure that the new wealth, like you said, the numbers are increasing. This is the first time that they are seeing this coming in, which is fine. I'm sure that they have the wherewithal and technology and people like you to help them with that.
Right.
But I'm interested in the older generation, because here it's very interesting to go deep into this, this phenomenon, because these are people who've been doing it for a long time. Your own, you said 26th generation. India has a few families, I think, which also are that old. But at the same time, there is the third generation curse. Okay, and this is global. Right. I know that. I know it's global, because almost every large country, Britain, for example, has a saying called from shirt sleeve to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Okay, and there are various sayings in India also, by the way. Ki pehla banaye, dusra something, and teesra gavaye, stuff like that. So I want to just talk about that for a while. I want to start with, is there such a thing? Have you guys done any research? Are there any statistics? I have some numbers that I read somewhere about how, a fairly large number of people kind of fritter away or lose their wealth. So let's start from there.
Sure. So my personal perspective, it's not necessarily in terms of the number of statistics that I have to kind of show, but probably in the current scenario it may be a myth, right? And I'll tell you the reasons why. So if you look at the older generation where they created wealth, the first generation, then the second generation, and the third generation, which, like what you said, known as squanderer, right? So how does that kind of really come into play? So there are 2 large aspects to it. One is in terms of the difference between being asset rich and being cash rich, and the second one is in being kind of financially literate.
Oh, nice.
Right.
Okay.
So these are the 2 aspects which I would like to touch upon.
Please.
So if you look at the earlier generation, which is, let's say, 2 generations behind, the capital markets are not so as evolved as what they are right now, right? So the large options available for wealth which was being created was going either into land or building or probably into gold and silver, right? That were the standard kind of investment options available. Also, at that point of time, if you look at one concept, which I don't know, it's just my perspective, is that the concept of family planning was looked down upon. Right. So if you look at the number of siblings in the family, right. So if you look at, it was an exponential growth.
So the family tree was complicated.
it becomes just
Huge,
complex,
yeah.
right? So having 3-4 siblings or 10 siblings was not unheard of in those days. So it only complicated the matters more as far as generation passing of the kind of wealth is concerned to the next generation.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect. And second was the liquidity of the underlying investments. So the fact that if you invest into land or into commercial property or residential property, the transition is not very easy to have. Right, and therefore, if you look at it, and these are all again asset rich, they are not cash rich. So
Correct.
the cash coming out of land is practically zero, right? Or even if you look at the yield coming out of a residential or a commercial property is not more than 3-5%,
Yeah.
right? So
Assuming they've even put it on rent.
assuming that they put
A
it on.
lot of people just leave it idle.
Yeah, because at that point of time,
Yeah,
keeping
yeah,
on
yeah.
rent was considered not very good, right?
Yeah.
Because there were not even enough laws to protect the rent act.
Encroaching and all those
Yeah,
kinds
so
of
rent
things,
act
yeah.
was not the way it is right now. So those factors, I believe, led to the fact that by the time you come to the third generation, right, they only hear about stories of grandfather being so rich, right? Because there was a lot of cash flow there.
Yeah.
And the grandfather's business, which was started at that point of time, probably no longer exists in the shape and form at which it was.
Correct. Yeah, yeah,
right? Because industry cycles change, the products change.
Within industries, the competitors change.
That's right.
Go on, please.
Right. So from that perspective, the third generation it became very difficult to manage the cash flow situation to maintain that kind of lifestyle. And that would be the reason why we have this notion saying that fine, the third generation generally squanders it off. And the second point, which is I think equally important, is the fact that there is a kind of probably a lack of financial literacy passed on to the third generation.
Yeah. I'm going to come to that. Yeah.
Right.
I am going to come to that. Please go on.
Yeah. So from that perspective, the availability of options, first of all, is much more now, right? So if you look at the capital markets, whether it is private equity or listed investments, equity, fixed income, rent act being protecting the kind of underlying properties which you are invested in, right? So monetization becoming very easy because there are a lot of buyers now, right? And also aggregation of wealth which is happening. So from that perspective, this third generation onwards. And we have seen that in Indian families, like what you saw recently what has happened with the Godrej's.
Correct.
We have seen the Tatas, we have seen the Birlas, right? Internationally, we have seen the Rockefellers, right? We have looked at the Pritzker family, that is the Hyatt chain, hotel family. So all of them have kind of found ways to kind of avoid that I would say a gap in between, where because of the quality of education passed on money and on investments is quite different.
Yeah. I want to talk about succession planning. Okay,
Sure.
because you've spoken about how this is, first, we've got the macro factors in place, which is that era was different, this era is different. You had physical assets there, you've got financial assets here, financial literacy issues were there, then now, of course, hopefully that's coming down. But stuff like making a will.
Right.
Yes, I know of at least a few very, very prominent, very, very large families where there was no will.
Yeah.
And then
we have seen the effects of that.
It's very ugly.
Third man takes it.
Third man takes it, or it gets very ugly.
Yeah.
You spend some time on succession planning out here. But I just want our listeners to kind of understand this, that, when they're talking about a large family with a lot of branches, or even a medium family, even a smaller family, the importance of a will and the importance of succession planning is quite important. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I think it's a not a very often talked about subject in families, and many times it is kind of considered to be a taboo. A lot of people, especially the current older generation, believe that what they will write in the will be the final thing, and that's their wish, and therefore the children need not know. Right. So those are the fallacies of the earlier thought process, which is now kind of changing very clearly, and that's where the idea of making a smooth transition of assets becomes important. So whether you are owning one flat or you're owning 10 flats, right? It doesn't matter. It is more from the perspective that what is it that you have made preparations to ensure a smooth transition of the wealth which you have. And to that extent, it kind of starts right from the fact that you can start with making a list of your wishes, right? That after you're not there, what do you wish to happen? That then translates into will, and that then can translate into various platforms which can help you to kind of ensure the smooth transition. Like for example, trusts are there, or LLPs are there, right, or partnership firms are there, right? So which will help the smooth transition happening, where there is a defined share of that particular sibling or the particular next gen, right, and therefore there is no ambiguity around it.
Yeah.
And to that extent, it is very important to have these things in place, starting with your letter of wishes, then your will, and then the trusts if required, depending on the complexities, and that's how succession kind of all begins.
Is this happening in India? I'll tell you why, right? Because one of the most famous serials the last few years, HBO Succession, literally it's called Succession. It's
Right.
super hit everywhere. People just loved it. The idea of a patriarch with three kids, okay, one daughter and two sons, just fighting over a lot of stuff, So everything that you said, I just realized that it also involves transparency,
Yes.
declaring assets, and it can just be a can of worms. So, any experiences there? I mean, how do you think transparency is now within families and within generational wealth in this aspect of succession planning?
So what we are increasingly seeing is that the second and the third generation is very deeply involved in the family aspects, because as I mentioned earlier, the wealth has grown to such an extent that is no longer something which can be kind of kept as a side business, right? There is generally one family member who actually is dedicated to looking after the family wealth.
Right.
Right, and therefore there has to be transparency. If there are three siblings and if only one of them is managing, there has to be understanding between all the three of them and the patriarch, saying that fine, this is how it will be managed. So therefore they kind of come together at various points in time. They understand what the investments are. They have what they call is an investment committee, right? And those kind of things are getting into place. But yes, there are families where they are kind of still at the kind of lower level of this understanding and kind of graduating to the next level. But my understanding and my interaction with the clients is that the patriarch generation and the generation after that is actually quite aware of what the implications of it can be. So it is not only in terms of fighting, but it is also in terms of costs attached to which, right? So the taxes, right, or the, like for example, if some subsequently inheritance tax comes in. So how do you really manage all these aspects of your succession, planning? That kind of comes into play.
Consolidation of wealth. I want to understand what this is. Second, why is it important?
So wealth is defined in various ways. So one very easy way to say is what is your wealth as far as your listed investments are concerned. So that's very easy to kind of understand, because it's all available and you can get the current pricing off the screen. But then there are a lot of non-financial assets. Like, so for example, you have real estate, land, right? Then you have vintage cars, you have art, right? You have jewelry, you have gold, you have silver, right? Now those are kind of assets which are not necessarily recorded at one place, right? So for succession to happen, the first step is consolidation, right? And not only that, consolidation will also help the current generations to make sure that they are kind of taking right decisions as far as their movement of assets are concerned, right? So typically, even if you look at listed wealth, there would be 2 or 3 advisors who are kind of the family is kind of dealing with, and therefore if today if I have to ask them, saying in the last 1 month the market has gone down by 5%, how much has your portfolio gone down by? So they will have to call up 3 people, they will have to consolidate, put in on Excel, and then say, okay, my portfolio has gone down by 3, but the market has gone down by 5. Now, instead of that, if everything is on one platform, right, where you are getting data on a real-time basis coming
like a dashboard?
Like a dashboard.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So we are getting data on a real-time basis at a click of a button. So whether the child is in India or the child is in Germany or USA, he knows what the what the kind of wealth is and where it is distributed. Right? So that is what consolidation helps. And therefore, when you come to the succession planning part of it, right? So we have seen many families fight over art, right? Over cars, right? And then that's where kind of or property.
Yeah, I thought you would say property first, but here you go with art and
we have seen those examples.
Amazing.
Right? So
some of them have played out in the newspapers.
In the newspapers, yeah.
Crazy, huh?
So that's where. So if that is listed, that is valued, right? On a say you value your jewelry every 3 years, right? You value your property every 5 years, right? So once that is put on, then the family is aware that this is what the net worth is and this is how it is distributed. Yeah. And what happens in consolidation is that you can kind of have a lot of options available where you are looking at it at an individual level, plus you are looking at a family group level, right? So as the kids grow, they will marry, they will have their own children, they will have their own family group, right? So what is one family group, second family group, third family group, and overall. Yeah. So that's how the consolidation helps.
I'm going to come to that because that part is something that I find quite interesting. But I want to just wrap this part, the consolidation and succession aspect with next generation. What's their scene? What people that families that you talk to, are they interested? Do they have financial literacy? First of all, or are they that whole stereotype that I have of Rais Baap ki aulad, that kind of stuff, spoiled brat, stuff like that. So what's your general overview of this next generation today?
So I think it is quite different, and as you get more and more money, I think the sense of responsibility also kicks in, and therefore this concept of kind of squandering, we are finding it much less.
Nice.
So it's more from the perspective that the children are getting involved at a younger age, and more importantly, the parents are wanting that to happen, and it is across genders. So we have a lot of family offices where there are females who are actually heading the family office, right? Or they are a regular part of the discussions, the decision making of the family office investment perspective as such. So that's a welcome change which has happened. And I am finding the third generation at many times advising the earlier generation in terms of what should be done and what would be the risk attached to that. So they understand the risk in I think a different perspective and a better perspective, which I'll give you a typical example. So there is there is something where the father has made a lot of money by taking risk, right? And he's therefore inherently my thought process that if I take risk, I will get a return, right? But the child, having seen the kind of risk that he has taken, does not want to take that risk on the investment portfolio.
I thought it would be the other way around, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
He would be more risky.
He would be more risky, but it is not.
Wow, nice.
Right. So he's kind of thinking of more saying, how do I preserve this wealth which has been created?
Yeah.
So we have instances where the father would kind of take more equity bets, and he would be okay taking derivative bets. But the son is saying that fine, let's look at REITs, let's look at InvITs, let us look at offshore investments. So that's where it kind of plays out.
Interesting choice of asset classes there. So now moving on to the family offices, per se, I want to understand, how do you start the engagement with them? Like, let's say that someone comes in from the family. Is it typically one member, spouse, child, two brothers, two generations? In general, of course, because I'm sure that there are specifics to each and every family, but in general, how does that process work? How do these guys step into an LGT office and start an engagement?
Yeah. So it depends and differs on what stage of wealth generation the family is in. So we have established family offices who also kind of come to us for a lot of other aspects. We have new to wealth families coming to us. And therefore, if I kind of look at these two different aspects, the new to wealth people will generally kind of come with one or two people. But that's where we encourage them to come with the spouses, to come with the other members of the family. So, for example, just over the last week, I've had one family where the father and two sons both came and met us. Right? The idea was for them to understand what are the next steps that we take. Okay. Now, similarly, if you look at the other side of it, where there is an established family office, there you typically will have one or two people, say the father and one sibling, who kind of manages the entire wealth, will come to us and say, fine, this is where we are, and how do we go forward, right? So it is a combination of both, but generally I think new to wealth is somewhere kind of, it's more in terms of understanding. They want to know what to do forward.
Do you advocate getting the entire family involved, at least at an initial level, so that there shouldn't be any clash between husband and wife, father and son? Have you faced any situation like this? And B, generally, how do you resolve this?
So basically, the right way to go about it is to make sure that you're doing the risk profiling for all the family members who are kind of coming in.
Okay.
So like what you said, some generation of the family may not want to take that risk, but the other generation may want to take a risk, and it could be other way around in the example which I gave, where the older generation is wanting to take more risk. So it is important that you understand at least at a family group level, what is the risk that they are wanting to take.
Okay.
At an overall family level, then they may decide that fine, if I aggregate everything, then I want say 60% into equity and 40% into debt, right, with zero into alternatives. So that could be their definition at a family level. But between that, or within that, there would be one family group which will say, fine, I don't mind taking more exposure to alternatives. So that's the way we need to kind of go around it, where we sit down with them, try and understand whether everyone is on the page, or we need to design different plans for different family groups. So that's how it kind of happens.
Okay, so last question before we go into the break is this, that now these families have been very good at making money. That's pretty obvious, because that's where their wealth comes from, right? Which is their business. Could be whatever XYZ business. And they make tons of money in that. And, are they as good about managing the money? They're leaving that to you, of course. So this is a call on your
Sure.
On your capabilities.
Right.
But at the same time, Do you find them, telling you that no, maybe you should do this, maybe you should do that, and you can make more rate of return and more rate of return there?
So it's a very interesting question, Anupam. And again, I would like to divide this into two parts. One is where the family has sold their businesses and are kind of only managing the money. That's where the involvement is much more intense because they are there in the market on a day-to-day basis, and therefore the kind of questions are very different. And the other aspect is where the wealth has been created, but the family members are also running the business. So it is more in terms of the time factor which kind of inhibits them to really kind of have a very detailed view of what's happening, and that's where they kind of also said fine, they are part of the meetings, but it'd be more of a fortnightly or a monthly review meeting.
Sure.
Under which they will kind of say fine, whether if you want to go in for this product or this risk or not. But the other side, the other generation is where or the other families are where they are wanting to know fine, who's the fund manager, let me talk to the fund manager, right?
Okay.
Can he kind of change the portfolio for me,
Nice.
right?
Okay.
Or if I'm kind of over invested in financials, so should I look at industrials more?
That hands-on.
That's hands-on.
Okay.
Right. So my exposure to kind of industrial. So should I buy more of this particular stock so that I can get more? Defense manufacturing looks interesting.
Sure.
What are the options available for me there?
Okay. Let me try one more, time on this same question. Let me take it in a different way. Okay. Now, when I have my usual advisors and fund managers for retail, and you keep on hearing things about how, I saw this guy's portfolio, he's got like 30 mutual fund schemes. Like, what is this guy thinking? 30 mutual fund schemes, overlaps, etc., asset allocation issues, diversification issues, etc. Have you found any wild stuff with these guys, with the family offices, where you feel that, what are these guys?
Yes, it is not uncommon.
Okay.
And like what they say in behavioral finance, it's that where you're not able to take a decision, and they don't believe that less is more, and they believe that more is more.
More is more.
Right. So that therefore what happens typically is that you end up having a long tail, which just unnecessarily keeps on wagging. And even if that tail kind of gives you good results, it's not going to make a material impact to your portfolio.
Okay.
Right. So we have these kind of instances where you have 70 stocks in the portfolio, where the top 20 stocks would be 90% of the portfolio. Typically, and similarly in schemes, right? You may have 30 schemes, but the performing schemes may be only 10. Right. So that is one aspect where kind of a lot of help goes in, because that actually brings down the returns, and it does not kind of decrease the risk.
Exactly. Yeah. So folks, that's the point that we want to make out here, is that whether you're handling your own portfolio, whatever the size, or whether it's a family office handling their investments or whatever size. Obviously, there'll be some differences here and there because the bigger size has other considerations than a smaller size. But the fact is that getting a certain investment rate of return on your portfolio is very different from your day job. Okay, the same example that we used out here about a family that's made tons of money in whatever they were doing, whatever business they're obviously very good at it. Nimish, let's get to specific patterns. Okay, now that we've spoken a lot about how these families are, what's good, what's bad, what they should do, etc. How do these guys invest? I know that it's a very generic question, but in general, what are the favored asset classes? Like if you were to make a list, like what comes number one? And here we're talking about investment, right? This is their wealth. It's like, the cash from the business becomes their wealth. Wealth is invested out here. So what are the asset classes that we're talking about?
Sure. So what I'm finding about this current generation and in the way they look at investments is that they are quite open to whatever is new coming in, right? So there are a lot of other aspects, and this is something which even the retail investors can actually kind of look at. It's not just simple mutual funds, equity, fixed income, right? It's not just that. It just goes beyond that. So there are a lot of say for example, let's start with global investing. Right, we very kind of firmly believe that diversification in terms of currency and geography is very important, especially now with India kind of growing the way it is, and more importantly, we have noticed that there is some part of the family which is not in India. Right. So
correct,
that's something either in terms of education or job or business, they're settled there. Right. So it's more from the perspective of how the family wealth is actually kind of managed, and importantly how you are making investments, which is now possible. So for example, now with the liberalized remittance scheme, which is there with $250,000 per person per annum, which is available, a family of 4 can very easily transmit $1 million. So even if it is not $250,000, even if we start with $50,000 or $10,000, you're creating a portfolio of offshore securities, And as you're aware, your Nasdaq or even your S&P 500 has given equal or better returns than what BSE 500 is or
Correct.
BSE 100 has given, right? So one is global diversification, which kind of becomes important, which they are very kind of keenly looking at. And now with the Gift City route available, where platforms like us are giving that option, where through the Gift City you are able to kind of very easily transmit monies and invest offshore, and in whichever geography you want. You may like a company in Germany, you may like a company based in UK, right? Or you may just want to buy a Nasdaq, right? So that all is available. Now, a simple thing like even a fixed income perspective in offshore, right? Now, in dollar terms, you are getting bonds today which are at 6% and 7% dollar yield. So why would you not kind of look at that with a 3 to 4% capital appreciation coming in because of the currency depreciation, right? So those options are which is safer, and plus you are kind of transferring wealth abroad. So those are the options which they look at. Second is in terms of, we talk about fixed income. Now the fixed income rates, the way they are, the taxation impact which is there. So it is not very conducive to kind of, say that fine, I will, whatever my fixed income allocation is there, I will put only into mutual funds. So there are a lot of options available. Now, for example, if you look at the unlisted, InvITs option, right? So they are, first of all, uncorrelated assets. They are not fixed income. They are not, equity. You are looking at investments which are primarily into, infrastructure assets. So whether they be road assets being managed by NHAI or whether there is a gas pipeline which is there. So you are uncorrelating your portfolio. You are reducing the risk, but you are getting a, instead of getting a 7-8% return, you're getting a 12 to 14% return. So can 10% or 20% of your fixed income portfolio be part of it, is what they are looking at, right? So that's another way of looking at it. Similarly, private equity, right? So private equity is now available at bite size.
So now I think you're moving up the risk ladder out here. You've covered global, you've covered fixed income, investment trusts and other assorted stuff. I kind of just stopped you there for private equity because this is a little bit risky, you would say. I mean, what's people who've managed their business, it makes sense for them to invest in other businesses also. But how do you pitch a deal to them? What, in what way, format, etc.?
Right. So those kind of deals are kind of, where either the promoter or the family is aware of that business, so they have been into that business, but it is a different spin to that business that they have came in doing, right? So for example, you may have a family which is into cement business, right? But there could be a company which is actually doing a lot of retail into infrastructure assets, right? So how does that family become interested in kind of looking at this particular avenue where you kind of all your infrastructure material which is required for construction is available online. Right, so that's one aspect of it.
So you recommend direct, or you recommend via, say, an AIF or something, or both?
It's both.
Okay.
So it depends on the kind of risk which the client wants to take, and therefore there is availability of both which is there on the private equity side. So to the point of risk, yes, you are increasing your risk, but as long as it is contained to your risk profile. So for example, I would not want more than 10% of my assets to be into this, but those are the ones where I could probably potentially get a much higher return compared to investing into equity markets. So it's like investing into small caps versus large caps, where you're taking a larger risk, and then beyond small caps there is pipe or micro cap, where you're kind of taking much larger risk.
Very interesting.
So it's a combination of.
So on the list so far, we've got global. Okay, global would have equities and bonds, and then you've got fixed income and alternatives, where you've got investment trusts, and now you've got private equity. What else is there?
Yeah, so then it also kind of boils down to other asset allocation within the equity and the fixed income space.
Okay.
Right. So there again, families are trying to understand how to catch the trends. Okay. Right. So for example, do you want to take certain thematic bets? Or do you want to take sectoral bets? Right. Or given the fact that so much of run up has happened in the mid cap and small cap, does it make sense to shift towards large cap now? And therefore those kind of thematic calls or asset allocation calls actually are taken much more actively than otherwise. That it's not no longer fill it, shut it, forget it. Right, it is more from the perspective fill it, shut it, monitor it, right, and therefore that monitoring happens very rigorously on the regular asset classes.
What I want to ask is this: that where is that line between return of capital and return on capital? Okay, because these are very wealthy people. Right. There is preservation. I'm assuming is like number one priority.
Yes.
Assuming, as an advisor, I'm assuming that that's what you would push. These are also people who love to take risks.
That's right.
So where is there a line at all out here where they're willing to take outsized risks for a certain rate of return that you kind of gently push back on? I'm making this point for our listeners also because they also need to understand that when it comes to preservation of capital. If you're someone who's been investing in the markets for 10 years through an SIP, you kind of suddenly think that you know everything. But sometimes it's just works to, for a retail portfolio, for example, to maybe book profits or at least keep on investing without messing around too much. How does that work with family offices in terms of return on and return off capital?
So again, a very difficult question to answer for families also. In terms of the return of capital which we are talking about, that's where again your entire risk chain will come in, right? So we are talking about taking various bets right from fixed income to private equity, right? And those are the kind of various risks that you can take. Now return kind of that's on the return on capital.
Yeah, return on
But
capital.
return
Yeah.
off
Off
capital,
yeah.
would be more from the perspective of the comfort that you have in the underlying managers,
Yeah.
the selection methodology which they have,
Yeah.
and therefore the kind of bet which you're taking on that manager,
Yeah.
and evaluating that on a regular basis is also equally important.
Yeah.
Right, we have managers who kind of fade in and fade out purely from the perspective of the thought processes which they have, and the either ability or inability to kind of catch the trend. Right, so at that point of time, what is the call that the family will take, whether my capital is at risk or it is kind of not at risk? And this typically happens more in terms of unlisted, where kind of you have to pay very close attention to that. On the listed side, it'll be more from the perspective of the asset allocation which you have within the the risk bucket that you have, whether small cap, mid cap,
Easier to
small cap.
switch. Yeah.
It is easier to switch and easier to kind of manage that.
Yeah.
But yes, it's a very interesting phenomena that it's.
Do you find someone gently coming up to you saying that my friend's got this new startup and he wants 10 crores from me? What do I do?
It's a regular question.
So do you keep aside money for friends fund or something, because I don't know whether that money is ever going to come back also.
Yeah, so I think that's where it's very important to have your governance charter in place, and therefore after with the government charter comes your investment risk policy. That is what are the do's and don'ts that you want to do as far as your investments are concerned. And what we do is that we show them the face in the mirror, saying that fine, you want to do that, you want to put 10 crores, but here is your exposure to this kind of particular risk asset class which is there.
Yeah.
And then it's a call which they need to take. But like what you rightly said, it is kind of definitely an issue. And in the past, like we were talking about that third generation issue, there have been a lot of issues coming up because loans given to friends and relatives, which has never come back.
Yeah, that's loans given to friends and relatives, believe me, you're going to lose one or both. I don't know which one, but
Yes.
It is so normal. And folks, for you also, honestly, I like to think of it this way, that lending money to a friend is a donation. So, if it...
No, in fact, we've also seen that even in the retail side. So, for example, a person is getting retirement money, right? And his neighbor or his relative, he started a new venture saying, "हाँ sir, मैंने ये दुकान लगाया, आप मेरे को 5 लाख रुपया दे दो." Now there goes it down the drain, right? So at that point of time, when he actually has to plan for his next 20 years or 30 years, he's actually kind of donating.
Yeah, I know. There's no answer to this, sir. I mean, this discussion can go on and on.
Yes.
But let's talk about something where we probably have an answer.
Right.
We are here sitting in May. I think the budget will probably come in July. And like every year, again, inheritance tax. Any thoughts, any views,
So inheritance tax, Anupam, as you know, is kind of, it's a yearly phenomena. It comes in every year wave and then kind of it subsides. When it comes, if it comes, is a different question. But the more important question is that can one be prepared for that? Right, and what does one need to do? And that's where families are kind of paying importance. That are there vehicle structures available where not only in terms of onshore, but for example, if you have a 1 foot in the U.S. market, right, or in the you have a U.S. citizen who is a part of the family, then how do you really manage that? Because their laws are very different. In India, if inheritance tax comes in, what to do? So there are various tools available where you can kind of transition your wealth to trusts, whether revocable or irrevocable, kind of cocoon them in a particular structure to make sure that the tax impact on such kind of transfers is kind of not felt earlier. Yes, will you end up losing control to a certain extent? Yes. But are you kind of protecting the family from the future shocks, especially the tax? Say it comes in at 20%, 30%. But I believe, I think since 1953 to almost in 1985, 86 is where the inheritance tax was there.
Okay.
Right. After that, in 85 or something, it was kind of abolished.
Yeah.
Now, again, there is a clamor whether it will or it will not come.
Yeah.
But I think one needs to be prepared for it. And there are various tools available with which, at least to some extent, you can plan.
Yeah. So winding up this episode, Nimish, I want to ask you this: that ultimately, money is money, and investments are investments. Could you give us a list of maybe tips or maybe a checklist or some advice for our listeners? You know, what I'm seeing nowadays is that a lot of people with obviously they wouldn't have the AUMs to come to someone like you, but they increasingly ask the question, now what do I do? You know, could be even a 30-year-old who's has 5 years of savings, and that's a reasonably large amount, and so on and so forth. And they just don't get that quality of advice, leave alone service. Okay, there's advice, there's service, there's hand holding. There's a lot that goes into these kind of relationships. I'm sure that you know that.
Sure.
What would you tell them here? I mean, in terms of, let's look at it in two ways. One is the advice part. When you go seeking advice for your investments, what should you look out for? Let's start from there.
Sure. So basically, it starts with the fact that what do you really want out of that money, right? So like what they say that in terms of what is the risk that you want to take, right? Is it that you are expecting, returns in 1 year, or you're expecting in 3 years, or you want to keep it for, many people come to us saying, hi, this is 30-year money, right? But the moment the market goes down by 10%, it suddenly becomes 3-month money.
Or overnight also.
Overnight also,
Yeah.
right? So that clarity has to be there, and that comes with the basic faith in the economy that you are investing.
Okay.
Right. So whether it is India or offshore, if you're investing in India, do you have a basic faith that for the next 3 years to 5 years, India is going to grow at say 6% with a underlying inflation at 4%? So 10% absolute
Normal,
growth
yeah.
is any case coming in. The companies in which I'm investing will give me about 1.5 to 2 times of that underlying growth which is there.
Okay.
So that's the basic faith I need to have before I kind of start investing also.
Yeah.
And with that faith in mind, that's the kind of, the next question would be in terms of where to invest
Yeah.
and what are the options available to me.
Yeah.
And that's where we kind of begin the journey with saying that, mutual funds, stocks, bonds,
Yeah.
the journey kind of goes from there.
So if I were to, my next question, and in fact the last question, would be that when it comes to this choice of asset allocation and diversification, do you have any broad guidelines? Like there's the 60-40 rule that a lot, 100 minus age. I think that's one thing that is there.
Yeah.
Just some general stuff that people know that, okay, I'm on the right track. Okay, I'll ask you two things. One is in terms of equity versus debt. How should one generally look at that? And second is passive versus active. Well, those are the two. I think those are the two stumbling blocks for a lot of people that I talk to in terms of how to design their portfolio. What happens is that they mess up on all sides. They'll either go over the top on equity, or they'll go extra safe on debt. They'll either have like tons of passive instruments now, because there are tons of
And
passive.
then complain that the returns are not there.
Thank you. So if we could
Yeah.
just talk finally on this aspect of equity versus debt and passive versus active. Some takeaways for our listeners.
Sure. So, the equity versus debt begins with your risk profiling and what is that you are expecting. I don't believe in the formula of 100 minus age. It is purely because, if you have money, then there is no question of being kind of safe, right? So, as long as your basic needs are met, then you don't need to be necessarily safe and say, I want 80% of my investments in, debt because I am 70 years old. Right? So that kind of formula doesn't work. So it is more from the perspective of what is the risk that you are kind of taking and what is the return that you want out of that portfolio.
Sure.
So once that is clear, then your equity component can definitely, but generally we are seeing that equity is anywhere between 60% to 80% of a client's portfolio.
Nice. Okay.
And especially if you're looking at the age gap of 30 to 50, right? And that's where generally people are kind of, heavily loaded. Now more so because of the taxation on debt. Right, so that has actually veered more kind of towards equity, and to that extent, it becomes important to kind of understand that kind of correlation between equity and debt.
Sure.
And the taxes matter.
Yeah.
So as of now, we are in a situation in India where equity is taxed differently from debt. I am sure as India progresses, that will kind of homogenize, and you will have the same tax whether it is fixed income or equity. But one has to be prepared for that.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect of that. The second aspect within that is in terms of the cost. So you'd be mindful of the cost which you're incurring when you're investing.
Sure.
And therefore that is something which an advisor will kind of tell you how to kind of go around that.
Linked to the cost is passive versus active, right? Because
That's right. So then therefore coming to passive versus active is that yes, some part of your portfolio should be into passive. Now there was till about, if you look at 3 months or 4 months back, there was a very definite thought process saying that large caps have not kind of outperformed. Large cap fund managers have not been able to outperform the passive benchmarks as such. So therefore, a lot of people went into passive. But if you look at the last 4 months, right?
It's reversed.
It's reversed,
Yeah.
right? So large cap fund managers have started performing because their inherent thought process that I don't want PSUs beyond a point, or I don't want a certain kind of sectors like
Whatever,
oil marketing companies and all that. I don't want it to be more
Correct,
than 10% of my portfolio.
Yeah.
That is actually now played out,
Yeah.
right? So it's all market cycles. So I would say that one has to be very careful when you're doing passive versus active. And now there is also a third option which is available, which is your passive plus. Or your factor-based investing,
Smart beta kind of
or
stuff.
your smart beta kind of thing. So that kind of gives you where you're playing on factors like momentum, or valuation, or even in terms of quality. So those are the aspects which are then available, and therefore I would say that passive should not be more than 15-20% of your portfolio.
Nice.
But
I don't hear that often.
otherwise, you will start complaining that the index is given 10 and I'm getting 9 or 10. But I have seen other schemes which are giving me 15%, 18%. Where have I gone wrong?
Yeah. Okay. I want to sneak in one more question actually.
Sure.
The prospect of, very happy prospect I assume, of people who get a large sum of money. Could be bonus, could be, that happens once in a year on one specific day, or could be staggered. Could be a liquidity event which, my options are vested and I'm selling out. And that gives me a really nice pot of money. Okay. Well, in general, what are the guidelines here for people? Because some of them might just go and buy a car. Some of them might just go and buy a house. Okay, now I leave that decision to them. I'm no one to judge them. How do you guys approach this?
So in terms of, for example, if there is a sale of company or there is a bonus which is coming in, right? It's something which is not expected and it comes in suddenly.
Yeah.
So yes, we do say that fine, whatever your requirements or aspirations are as far as your lifestyle is concerned, you kind of set aside that pot of money and that you kind of pre-decide, and that's fine. Otherwise, it's not an endless. Otherwise, what typically happens is that the money comes in, it lies for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, and then suddenly you see it disappear.
Exactly.
Because like what you said, you buy a fancy watch or a car or a fancy bag, right? But important is that if you're setting aside when the money is coming in, saying that okay, 20% of that I'm going to kind of set aside for my lifestyle requirement, and 80% I will kind of invest.
That's a good number. It's a generous number.
It's
old timers like me would say 90-10 or maybe 95-5, maybe even 100
Yeah.
should go into investment
because
completely.
inflation is now
But 80-20 is a good number.
Yeah.
20% set aside for indulgence or whatever.
and that money, I would say that take more risk, whatever you're investing.
Interesting.
So that 80% you can take more risk than what you would normally do from your normal salary. So that 80% don't put it again into an SIP, which is the same asset allocation as was there earlier.
Oh, nice.
Because there's something which you're not expected.
It's a lump sum.
It's a lump sum, and therefore you can take that risk, saying that fine, let me kind of take more kind of risk, unless you have a goal in mind, saying I want to buy a house after 3 years, and this will help me buy that house. Then it's a different thing.
Oh yeah, well, then that gets allocated there directly.
Then you go into arbitrage fund for the next 3 years till the time that you are going to buy a house.
Keep your goal in mind.
Keep your goal in mind.
Keep your goal in mind, and of course.
But otherwise, take risk and kind of invest, and because that's where your wealth creation will happen.
Yeah, because what happens is that a lot of advisors, a lot of people just go into this default mode. I'll take the entire thing and put it into a debt fund, and then do an SWP into equity.
Yeah.
But I didn't. This is in fact a very interesting angle to look at, where you increase the risk and say to dial up, and just go with it.
Yeah.
Because your regular SIPs are going on any which way.
Yeah.
So folks, that is it. Of course, please consult an advisor before doing all of these investments. These are just individual points of view given by Nimish. Please consult an advisor. Remember, he's an advisor himself who's, advising some fairly large family offices. And listen, guys, money is money. So whether you're advising a family office or even your own portfolio, there's some principles, especially risk. Risk will not change. Yeah.
True.
So understand your risk, understand your goals, and invest accordingly. Nimish, we have a standard question for all our guests who come in here. What book are you reading, or any content recommendations for our listeners?
I've kind of started rereading this book, which is The Art of Thinking Clearly by Ralph Dobelli.
Nice. I like the fact that you're rereading it. Why did you pick up that?
So I am reading it almost after about 4 or 5 years. And more from the point of view that the day-to-day fallacies which you have and the kind of traps that you fall into, right? Like what we spoke about, the long tail, right? It can happen to you and me also,
of course.
right? So how do you kind of protect against that, or survivorship bias, right? You always think that the decisions which you are taking are always kind of going to be right? So how do you kind of overcome that and apply that in your business also, and also in your day-to-day life? So it's a wonderful book. I would recommend people to read.
Very interesting. Thank you for the recommendation. And folks, that is a wrap on this episode of Paisa Vaisa. My guest, Nimish Shah, Managing Director, Family Offices and Portfolio Analytics at LGT Wealth India. Nimish, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
IVM